The sun rose over Harare, painting the streets gold, but the people carried only paper. Men and women trudged toward the market with bulging suitcases, their arms straining not from groceries but from banknotes. Inside those cases lay millions, sometimes billions of Zimbabwean dollars. And yet, all of it together could buy only one thing, a single loaf of bread. Vendors stood behind wooden stalls, surrounded not by goods, but by chaos. A baker lifted one warm loaf from his basket and watched as 3 customers waved stacks of notes higher than their heads. The crowd shouted, bills fluttered like leaves in the wind, but he could sell to only one. The loser stormed away, clutching useless paper that was losing value by the hour. In that moment, money itself had become a cruel joke. Once, a single note could buy groceries for a family. Now, entire suitcases barely bought a meal. The currency that was supposed to bind society together had turned into confetti. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe was not just numbers on a chart. It was children going to bed hungry while their parents carried mountains of worthless cash. It was old men burning banknotes for warmth because fire would cost more. It was a nation learning, day by day, that trust, once broken, cannot be printed back into existence. This is the story of how it happened. There was a time when Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa. The land stretched wide and fertile, with rolling farms of maize, wheat, and tobacco swaying in the wind. Rivers glimmered under the sun. Trains carried grain from the countryside to the cities, and markets bustled with fresh vegetables, meat, and bread that smelled of yeast and promise. In the 1980s, after independence, hope bloomed. Families dreamed of new beginnings. Children filled classrooms, writing in exercise books stamped with the proud new flag. The Zimbabwean dollar, fresh and crisp, carried portraits of heroes and images of Victoria Falls, a symbol of wealth and stability. On paydays, fathers bought bread, milk, and meat with a handful of notes. Mothers saved coins for school uniforms. There was trust in the currency, trust in tomorrow. But beneath that surface, cracks were forming. The government borrowed heavily, promising prosperity that never fully arrived. Corruption crept in like a shadow. Political struggles drained resources. Farms once owned by generations of experienced growers were seized and redistributed in chaotic waves, leaving fertile fields idle, machinery rusting under the sun. At first, the changes were subtle. Bread cost a few more cents, transport a few more dollars. But families adjusted, believing it temporary. After all, Zimbabwe was rich in land, in people, in potential. How could it all collapse? Yet collapse was coming. Quietly at first, then all at once. It began with the printing press. To pay debts and fund promises, the government printed more money. Notes rolled off machines in endless streams, each one devaluing the last. The first time prices doubled, people grumbled but paid. The second time, they worried. By the third, fear began to take root. The Zimbabwean dollar, once a proud symbol, was starting to unravel. And with it, so was the life people thought they could trust. At first, the change was almost invisible. In Harare, a schoolteacher named Miriam collected her paycheck at the end of the month, just as she always had. She tucked the notes neatly into her purse and stopped at the corner store on the way home. Bread, milk, cooking oil, the basics. But that day, the notes that once filled 2 baskets now bought only one. She frowned, muttered under her breath, but she paid. By the next month, it was worse. Her salary, meant to carry her family for 4 weeks, barely lasted one. Prices leapt so fast that by the time she returned to the shop, the cost had risen again. The grocer shrugged, helpless. The supplier charges more every morning. I cannot sell for less. On the bus ride home, Miriam overheard 2 men whispering. They say the government is printing more. Too much more. The other laughed bitterly. Printing money cannot make bread. It only makes paper. In the markets, vendors began to demand payment in advance. Pay me today, pick it up tomorrow. One woman selling maize told her customers. They grumbled, but they paid, afraid that by tomorrow the price would double again. The spiral quickened. A loaf of bread that cost a few dollars in January cost 20 by July, then 50, then 100. Parents began sending children to the store with wheelbarrows instead of wallets. Not because they needed more food, but because they needed more notes just to pay. By the time workers received their salaries, the money had already lost half its value. Men rushed from offices the moment wages were handed out, sprinting to markets before prices jumped again. Shops filled with desperate crowds waving bills, shouting, pushing, begging. And still, the printing presses rolled on. The government insisted it was temporary, that relief was coming. But on the ground, families could see the truth. The currency they trusted was dying. And with it, trust in the entire system. By 2007, the spiral had become a freefall. Miriam, the schoolteacher, received her monthly salary in thick bundles of notes tied with string. She no longer carried a purse, she carried a canvas sack. When she opened it at the market, children laughed, not with joy, but with disbelief. The sack was full, yet all it bought was a handful of vegetables and a small packet of cooking oil. Vendors no longer bothered to count each bill. They weighed them instead, tossing stacks onto small kitchen scales, adjusting prices with every gust of wind. A factory worker named Tendai found his paycheck useless by the time he walked home. In the morning, his wages could buy bus fare and a loaf of bread. By evening, they bought neither. He stopped saving money entirely. What was the point of saving paper that melted in value like ice under the sun? Shops emptied. Shelves that once held sugar, flour, and soap now gaped like broken teeth. People queued outside supermarkets from dawn, hoping a delivery truck might arrive. Often it never came. At night, families sat in dark rooms, candle flames flickering over walls. Some burned banknotes in small stoves because wood and charcoal cost more than cash itself. The smell of ink and paper filled kitchens where once the scent of sadza and stew had lingered. In the streets, the currency became a theater of absurdity. A single egg cost billions. A bus ride required a plastic bag stuffed with notes. A loaf of bread sold for $1 trillion. Prices doubled not by the month or week, but by the hour. Miriam remembered the day she saw her first $100 trillion bill. She held it carefully, as if it were a museum piece, not legal tender. By then, money had lost its meaning. Children played with stacks of notes, as if they were building blocks. Men carried salaries in wheelbarrows. Women traded cabbages for soap, clothes for maize meal. In Harare's markets, the language of exchange shifted. How many loaves for these shoes? What can I get for my radio? Barter returned, an ancient rhythm reborn in modern chaos. Trust was gone. Trust in the dollar, trust in the state, trust in tomorrow. And without trust, even money, the very glue of society, crumbled to dust. By the end of 2008, life in Zimbabwe no longer revolved around planning for the future. It was about surviving each day. Miriam stopped teaching. Her school had no chalk, no books, no electricity. Parents pulled their children out anyway. Who could afford tuition when bread itself was out of reach? She tried selling vegetables on the roadside, but every morning she faced the same cruel joke. By the time she set her prices, the value of the dollar had already fallen again. Tendai, the factory worker, left his job. The machines at his plant stood silent. There was no fuel to run them, no parts to repair them, no customers who could pay. He joined thousands of others walking to the border with South Africa, carrying what little they owned. Men and women crossed rivers at night, hoping to find work, to send back remittances in South African rand or US dollars, currencies that still held meaning. In the city markets, the suitcase of money became a symbol of absurdity. Housewives dragged them across crowded stalls, only to leave with a few tomatoes and maybe a loaf of bread. One man carried his salary in a wheelbarrow, only to be robbed, not of the money, but of the wheelbarrow itself. International aid groups arrived, bringing bags of maize meal, cooking oil, powdered milk. Lines stretched for blocks, people holding ration cards with trembling hands. For many, it was the only meal they would see that day. But the greatest wound was invisible. It was the collapse of faith. People no longer believed in banks, in paychecks, in promises stamped with official seals. Old women buried worthless bills in the ground because they could not bear to look at them. Fathers sat silently in darkened rooms, ashamed they could not feed their families. Children grew up measuring value not in money, but in survival: a plate of food, a bar of soap, a candle to keep the night away. By early 2009, Zimbabwe's own currency was abandoned. Shops began pricing goods in US dollars and South African rand. The local notes, even those marked with 100 trillion, became souvenirs, reminders of a collapse so deep it erased the meaning of money itself. For Miriam, for Tendai, for millions like them, the question was no longer, what does my money buy? But simply, how do I make it to tomorrow? When the Zimbabwean dollar finally died, it left behind more than empty wallets. It left scars on every household. For years afterward, Shopkeepers kept bundles of worthless notes tucked under counters, reminders of the madness. Some framed the trillion-dollar bills on their walls, not as currency, but as warnings. Tourists bought them as curiosities, laughing at the absurdity. But for those who had lived through it, there was nothing funny. Miriam, once a teacher, now worked as a caretaker in South Africa, sending money home in US dollars. She told her children stories of classrooms, books, and uniforms, as if describing a lost world. Tendai returned years later, thin but alive. The factory never reopened. His old neighborhood had changed, shops shuttered, homes abandoned, families scattered. Yet life went on. Markets reopened, this time with foreign currency. Trucks rolled in again, shelves refilled. Slowly, painfully, Zimbabwe began to breathe. But the nation's trust was broken. Savings accounts had been erased. Pensions vanished. Lifetimes of work turned to dust. People no longer asked, "How much is it?" They asked, "What currency are you taking?" The collapse had stolen more than wealth. It had stolen faith. Faith in the promise that hard work would provide, that tomorrow would be better than today. And that loss of faith lingers long after the money itself is gone. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe was not just an African story. It was a human story, a warning carved into history with ink and pain. Because money, at its heart, is not paper. It is not numbers on a screen. It is trust. Trust that the note in your hand will still mean something tomorrow. Trust that your salary will feed your family. Trust that the system will hold. When that trust shatters, even the strongest economy collapses. In Zimbabwe, the printing presses ran day and night, spitting out promises no one believed. And each new bill carried less value than the one before, until 100 trillion bought only a loaf of bread. The lesson is clear: no government, no nation is immune. Whether in Africa, America, or anywhere else, the moment people lose faith in money, society itself begins to crumble. For Miriam, for Tendai, for millions, the scars remain. But for us, their story is a mirror. It asks a question we cannot ignore. What is the true value of the money in your pocket? And what happens if that value vanishes overnight? In the end, the collapse of Zimbabwe's currency reminds us of one unshakable truth. Wealth is not paper, not ink, not even gold. It is trust. And once lost, trust is the hardest currency to ever regain.